I hope you all had a nice coffee break. Welcome to our next session about brain-inspired robotics and computing. I'm here instead of Steve Ferber, who unfortunately was not able to make it here to the summit. So we are already a little bit late, so I won't waste more time. Our first speaker is Julian GÖLTZ from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Please, Julian.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, I'm Julian GÖLTZ. I'm a PhD student with Mihai Petrovic at the Neuroteam E-Lab, both in Bern at the Department of Physiology and the Kirchhoff Institute for Physics at Heidelberg. I really appreciate the chance of being here and telling you about deep learning and spiking networks on neuromorphic hardware. It's a particular story about research that has been published in Nature Machine Intelligence. It's work with collaborators, most notably Laura Grine, who shared a lot of the burden of work. It's all about neuromorphics. Neuromorphics is at the core of this project. Neuromorphic hardware is a new class of compute hardware that is touted as an alternative to classical computing. It's developed, that's where the name comes from, with the brain as an inspiration. And there's a lot of different neuromorphic hardware, neuromorphic substrates. You see here a few of them, SpiNNaker, Loihi, Dynapse, and BrainScales 2. Two of those have been developed within HBP, SpiNNaker and BrainScales 2. I'm going to talk about our research on BrainScales 2, the system developed in Heidelberg. Those different systems share some similarities. So, for example, it tells me that my time is up. That must be right. They have some similarities, like they share some spiky communication. The units on these hardware, they communicate via spikes. They have a lot of differences as well, but yeah, they share the similarity of spiky communication and the energy efficiency as a goal of the thing. When we set out with our research, we thought that maybe if it's an alternative to classical computing, it's also an alternative, or it can serve as an alternative for ANN simulations. And for this, the crucial question was how to do error backpropagation in these spiking neural networks. And to elaborate on this question, I have to go a bit into detail. On many of those neuromorphic systems, the model of the neurons that is implemented there, it's so-called leaky integrated fire neurons, or LIF for short. What they do is they have a leak, they integrate and fire. So if an input comes, you see here the typical output or response of a neuron to some input. The voltage, this is the dynamical variable of the neurons, rises first, reaches the maximum, and then decays back to the leak. So it's integrating the input, that's the rise, and then it's leaking back to some voltage. It's called firing because if it integrates enough of these inputs and reaches a threshold, then there will be a spike, an output spike, which communicates to the next neurons. And at this spiking, at this threshold crossing, there's a reset of the voltage. So there's a discontinuity in the voltage. And this discontinuity is where part of the problem lies. That it's really hard to do gradient descent, so derivative-based methods with this non-continuous variable. There's another problem, and that is if you look at the spike time, so we have the same setup here, two inputs coming to this neuron, orange and black, and they are sufficient to elicit an output spike at some output spike time capital T. Now, if we shift one of the input spike times, the orange one, to earlier times, then the output spike time, here in blue, is then at later times. But if we shift the input spike time to later times, so we delay the input spike, then the output spike is delayed as well. And this the fact that the output spike time gets shifted to later times, no matter whether we shift the input spike time to earlier or later times, this is so-called non-monotonicity. And this is a problem because it means the input-output relation is a difficult function, and it's not easy to do gradient descent with this. Now, what we found out during this research that in special cases for this output spike time t, we can find an explicit relation for this output spike time. Now, the exact form of these equations is not so important. It's also the only slide with equations on it. The point is that we have an explicit formulation, analytic formulation for the spike time. And it's also differentiable. So for this output spike time, we can calculate the derivatives with respect to the input weights and the input spike times. This first equation, the derivative with respect to the input weights, gives us a method to relate a deviance, a change in, or an error in output spike times with a change in the weights that connect to this neuron. And the second line, the derivative of the output spike time, capital T, with respect to the input Ti, means we can relate this error in output spike times with an error in input spike times. And this means we can relate over multiple layers errors in these spike times, differences in these spike times. And this means we can solve the credit assignment problem in deep layers of neurons and can then adapt with gradient descent weights in these spiky neural networks to complete some task. Until now, this is very theoretical. It's just math written down. We put this in practice in actual training. We used a hierarchical network, so no recurrency for now. We use the time to first spike encoding. This means that stronger features elicit earlier spike times, and less strong features later spike times. It also means that we decode the output with this. So the classification, if we're looking at classification setups, is determined by the neuron that spikes first. Now, I said it's about neuromorphics, and we put this onto the chip, the BrainScales 2 chip developed by the Electronic Visions group in Heidelberg. The way we did this is in an in-the-loop setup, that's what we call it. This means we provide the chip with activities with input spike times, get some recordings, the activities, the output spike times. From this, on a host PC, calculate updates, use this for the next step, and train the network like this. It's been done on the BrainScales 2 system. This is developed by the Electronic Visions group in Heidelberg. It's a mixed signal neuromorphic hardware, and this means that while the communication happens via digital spikes, the neuron cores, these units, they are actually analog. So they have these quantities, the voltages, they are actually on the chip. You see this here in an oscilloscope image that you can plug to the chip and then look at the voltages on this chip. And this means that you don't have to calculate step by step, like in a digital simulation, how the dynamics evolve. You can actually just provide the input spikes and then have a look at what's going on. And this is where a lot of the energy efficiency comes from. It's also an accelerated system, BrainScales 2, and this means the typical times constants of millisecond in biology are on the order of microseconds in the system. We used the typical MNIST digit recognition task, classification task. You see some example images on the right. We trained this in this feed-forward network on this chip in this in-the-loop setup, and we got for the size of the network that we're using very good accuracies in the setup. You see on the right actual voltage recordings of this of what's going on in this chip of the fully trained network. And if you just look at the first line, for example, this blue neuron, the blue curve that you see, this fires first, and it's the neuron that codes for the class of 0 digit. So in all these cases, there's multiple recordings here. This is a correct classification. There's multiple recordings here because we wanted to show that this is an actually analog system. So different reruns, different tries will behave or will produce somewhat different results because it's an analog system. There's thermal noise, there's noise in the spike time sometimes. It just produces different results. But the training method is stable, and the substrate is good enough and works well and reproducible so that we can use this very precise method. Also, you see here the time scales really are on the order of milliseconds, microseconds. Sorry, the classification is done in a very short time, and this is the central point. We could use this method, or we use this method for this MNIST classification. We used the whole MNIST test set, so this is 10,000 images. If you don't notice, we started the time on the host computer, sent the images away to the chip, got the classification or the spikes back, determined the classification, and after that stopped the timer. And for this whole test set, this 10,000 images, this took less than a second. All the while, the substrate only consumes 200 milliwatt in power. So this is very good energy per classification. That comes down to 8.4 microjoule. Now, Mihai yesterday was already giving you some reference for what this energy per classification does. I want to give you another comparison for the power. And this is, here you see again this image with the oscilloscope, and you see some LEDs there. When we're switching from one version of the chip to the next version, it somehow wasn't, we got power that was a bit off by 30 milliwatts. And it turned out, after some collaboration with the Heidelberg group, that there was still these control LEDs soldered onto the chip, and they consumed 1/6 of the total power. So the chip is so power efficient that it runs on like 6 times what this LED uses. I want to stress here that this project benefited enormously from the Human Brain Project. First, because this neuromorphic substrate, in particular the BrainScale 2 chip, was developed within HBP and wouldn't have been possible without. And also because this collaboration here was fostered by the Human Brain Project. And with this, I want to thank the Electronic Visions group and also my own group, the Neuro Team A-Lab with Mihai Petrovic.
Thank you very much for this great talk, and also thank you for keeping very well in time. We will postpone the questions to the end of the session due to the advanced time. So the next speaker here is Jens Pedersen. Please come. Please come up, Jens. He's from KTH Stockholm. And please, Jens.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here and be invited, even though I wasn't the one being invited. I'm here on behalf of my colleague Juan, who did by far most of the work here, so I shouldn't be stealing all the credit. Yeah, I'm here to talk about real-time processing of events, and all the work that Julian and others are doing in inventing algorithms for neuromorphic systems are incredibly important, but at some point they need to be manifested in the real world, and that's really what we work with. So what I'll try to talk about now is how we can take specifically event camera data, I'll come back to what that is in a second, through some neuromorphic computing into real-life systems. So what you see down in the lower right corner is the logo of our lab. I don't mean to say we put brains on wheels, that's not what we do, but it's an indication of what we mean when we say neurorobotics or neuromorphic robotics. How do I use the mouse here? Clever. So what I'll briefly outline is what I mean by real-time neuromorphic computing. I'll talk a bit about what we then did to work with SpiNNaker specifically. For those of you who don't know, SpiNNaker is one type of neuromorphic system. I won't go into details of that, but it's a wonderful platform that basically digitally simulates neurons and lots of them. I'll then talk about an application where we can see what this actually gives us, and finally give some outlook on what that means going forward. So I work in the Neurocomputing Systems Lab at KTH Stockholm, and what we care about is really this real-time immersion into the world. As any good robotics lab, we of course named all our robots. So we have, according to the Norse mythology, our robot dog Fenrir, this wheeled robot Duran. We have an interactive robotic head and a robotic arm I'll get back to later. But the point really is to move these things with principles similar to biological nervous systems. And to do that, you need some kind of compute. You need to reason, adapt, compute, think, process, and then react to the real world. And to do that, we can either use simple GPUs. That's a thing many other people are doing, so that's not so exciting. We can also use neuromorphic computing, and not a lot of people are doing that, so that's what I'll focus on today. To do that, we're very concerned about also using biologically plausible signals, and that's where event-based vision comes into play. And for those of you who don't know, event-based vision is a novel technology, or a few decades old, that basically records changes in luminosity per pixel. So if you imagine a rotating, spinning disk in the upper part of the figure, then a frame-based camera will roughly 30 times per second give you a complete picture of what's on the pixel viewpoint, if you will. An event-based camera has a much finer time-granular recording of the point cloud of events that is emitted by the spinning disk. That gives you a much better time resolution. And so what I'll show you here is a chaotic pendulum, that's the static image to the left, being recorded with this event-based camera. So what you see here is, first of all, that the image is very sparse. You don't see a lot of data if there's nothing that changes in the scene. But what you also see is that actually there's a lot of finely detailed singular events emitted exactly when luminosity changes. And those are the events that we send from the camera into SpiNNaker to process. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of them. And before I get to what that means in the present project, I just want to demonstrate one application where this is relevant. So what you see in the lower right corner is our robotic arm, SIF. And that robotic arm is put up in a workplace where we mounted 3 static event cameras. And the task of this specific problem is to detect some object moving and then having the robot arm follow that. That's a quite trivial test, if you will, just to make sure that we can project these event cameras into a 3D space and follow it in real time. So the reason why that's a bit challenging is, first of all, it's real time. That's always difficult, but also because these cameras, each of them emits around 2 million events per second in a low resolution setting. So in total, we need to ferry 6 million events across the network into our brain, if you will, SpiNNaker, compute, then send signals back to the robot. To do that, we initially tried something out on normal conventional compute hardware, GPUs. We constructed a real-time streaming library for processing these events and used the Norse spiking simulator that runs on GPUs. And what you can see in the middle of the figure here is that we actually correctly predict 3 different coordinates for the 3 different cameras, and then merge them in one combined 3-dimensional pose. So the problem here is that this is not neuromorphic because we're using GPUs. So the question we're asking for the present project is, what then do we have to do to get this running on SpiNNaker? And to do that, we first of all have to come back to these million of events. Because if you use SpiNNaker, the neuromorphic hardware platform, by just sending events over Ethernet, you maximum get 200,000 per second. That's of course not good enough. So for the project here, we had to develop a custom interface board that we can plug right into the SpiNNaker modules to the right here. And what you see in the lower right corner is actually a rack. So that's 24 boards put in parallel that we kindly borrowed from the Manchester team. And with that interface board, we can actually stream events from the camera into the interface board that connects directly with the routing fabric of SpiNNaker, so that we can ferry around 10 million events per second, at least. We still don't know the upper bounds of this. But the wonderful part of this is that this interface board really integrates with the neuromorphic principles of the SpiNNaker machine. So SpiNNaker works, very briefly, by having a very large routing mesh. And the SpiNNaker interface board connects directly to the FPGA bridges on SpiNNaker to then stream events directly into these distributed core. And of course, it gives you much higher bandwidth than if you had a single bottleneck into the entire brain, quote-unquote, system. For those of you familiar with Pine or Python, it's quite simple to work with. You simply just specify that now you're not taking inputs from Ethernet, you're taking input from the SPIF board. And what I want to show you now is some benchmarks that proves that it actually works quite well. So first of all, we wanted to measure how much latency we can reduce. And for event-based vision, that's very important because these cameras have a sub-millisecond time resolution. right? So we get events with sub-millisecond precision. So of course we want to react to that very fast, and there's a very biological reason for that, because we want to run away before the tiger eats us, not after. So we're happy to see that we actually get much faster response time. What you see here to the right is also the throughput argument in empirical data here. So the red curve that you see in the bottom, that's the normal Ethernet interface. And that saturates around 150 events, 150,000 events per second. The green curve, or the green points, are then measurements from this SpiNNaker interface board that you can see can process way more events than the Ethernet connection. So what does that give us? And here, what you see is an example of the same chaotic pendulum I showed before. The image to the right is a convolutional kernel that we can configure, if you will, on the SpiNNaker chip. So we can design our spiky neural network. And this is just a very simple example. We have a convolution that then tracks the target, so the target blob you see on the chaotic pendulum. This is excellent because we can exploit the millisecond time resolution and the energy properties of SpiNNaker. So what you see here is a slowed down version of the event-based recording from the chaotic pendulum, and the red dot is then a network prediction of where this pendulum is. And again, remember that this is working in extremely high speed. So again, these events coming at thousands of hertz of more. So we can track this in extreme speeds with very low cost compared to what you would otherwise have to buy if you wanted to do high-speed recordings. So that's very, very neat. We're very excited about this because there are many, many more applications. We just started, or we just finalized, if you will, the benchmarks for this board, and there are way more applications we can think about. So I'm specifically working on biologically inspired vision. You can consider working with the control systems for our robots I showed you before. There are more ideas about closed-loop learning and plasticity, maybe with some of the rules from Julian. So to summarize, we are demonstrating high-performance event streaming with our library, AEstream. We built this custom SPIF board, and that gives us real-time object tracking. It's just one of many applications we're looking forward to explore. I have to thank a lot of people involved, so Luis Plana, Andrew Rowley, and Simon Davison from Manchester, among many others. Juan, who should have been here instead of me, and Jörg from KTH, and all our collaborators in HBP. Please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we come to the last speaker in the young researchers part of our session. It's Tom Knowles from the University of the West of England. It's in Bristol, I think.
Yes.
Please, Tom.
Cool. Hello there. Yeah, nice to see you all. Thank you very much for the invite. So my talk's going to be taking you all through sort of a slice through several pieces of work we did, which has brought us into heavily using the NRP, and just take you through how that's gradually become a pillar of our core to our work. So just briefly, just to set the scene for you all, make sure you all sort of understand sort of where we're coming from as a group. We originally, and this is sort of before my time, before I officially came in the group, we joined as part of the EpiSense project and the NRP. So that was involving a huge number of approaches. We're talking about behavioural studies. We're trying to find localize in the brain where episodic memory, areas responsible for episodic memory. And the core kind of idea, the core thrust of our approach was trying to see, or the idea that multimodal sensory reconstruction is core to the function of episodic memory. So when you have that recall process, what supports and underlies that are these multimodal representations that you capture through interacting with the world. And also, again, largely sort of before my time, but again, supporting the work we've done, we have our robot called Whiskeye, so which some of you will have seen before and be familiar with. So this is a heavily tactile robot. You can see the picture in at the top there, and interacting with an object at the bottom. It's got these large arrays of whiskers that it uses as an active sensing system to interact with objects. When it finds an impingement on a whisker, it can then orient to that object and use that process to autonomously explore the world. So if you set the robot down and get it running, it will find the most salient thing in its tactile space and then gradually explore the world autonomously. And then on top of that, so that's our sort of robot platform. Again, it's sort of a very reactive kind of intelligence. To add some learning on there, our colleagues at Amsterdam are putting together this implementation of predictive coding called multi-PredNet. And the great thing about multi-PredNet is, again, not only is predictive coding great, but we have the ability to use sort of conventional deep learning tools as a substrate to run this on. So it's all built in TensorFlow. And if I can direct your attention just to all the way over to the right, to that multi-sensory module there, that's kind of the core of how this operates. That's where the innovation comes in there. So the individual visual and tactile models are trying to reconstruct and build representations to explain, what the robot's seeing through its cameras, what the robot is feeling through its whiskers. But then you have this multi-sensory module at the end that's, because it's connected to both streams, needs to come up with latent representations to predict both vision and tactile events that are coming in. And this is all done, the learning is all done locally, so it still remains bioplausible despite the fact it's running on conventional deep learning systems. And again, just briefly before I go into the NRP work, so we did some work to validate this approach. We had the WhiskEye running around in the real WhiskEye in a visually and tactile rich environment. We trained the multi-PredNet on the data we gathered from that, and then those representations, we used the CreezeCorp RDM approach to compare the representation space, the differences in representation in this latent multisensory layer, comparing that to what we call the pose of the robot, so just the X, Y, and theta location, place of the robot, and we found this very strong correlation. And what that shows is that simply by allowing the robot to explore or having this running on a mobile robot platform, the multi-PredNet is able to extract some latent variables that are relevant to localizing where the robot is in the world and also what direction it's looking in. Cool. So then, given all this, we then decided that we were trying to remain biomimetic in our approach. So the NRP, the Neurorobotics platform, became sort of an obvious choice of where to go next. So this is this was the first step of getting this working within the NRP. First of all, we had this physical robot. We had to make a virtual version that would go into Gazebo, and then with help from the team at TUM, we ported that into the Neurorobotics platform, and then what you see there is the sort of the fruits of that. So it looks very jittery, but that's sped up to save the video taking an hour. But it's autonomously navigating around a rich 3D environment, and because we're on the NRP, we can expand that as much as we want. We're limited to quite a small arena in the lab, but which is about one of those rooms there. But with the NRP, you can expand that as far as you like because you're in simulation. And we're also able to port all the control code over. So we have now working facsimile of WhiskEye with all the control architecture ported over into NRP transfer functions so that it all runs in sync with any brain model that we want to add. And then speaking of the brain model, colleague Rachel put together several models. So the one I'll talk about today, we wanted to tease apart more this idea of multi-PredNet being able to predict where the robot is in the world and where it's looking. And we thought the simplest place to start was, okay, let's just solve theta. Let's solve the angle the robot is facing in relation to the environment. So we looked into the literature as to how the brain supports an internal representation of head direction. Seems to be involving the dorsal tegmental nucleus and lateral mammillary nuclei. Bidirectional connections forming what is thought to be a ring attractor network, so a single bump of activity that can be pushed along by a vestibular input. In our case, because we're using robots, that's just the angular velocity signal from the odometry. And then we have a bioplausible way to track head direction in nest. And because it's in nest, it then ports very well into the NRP. Now, the unfortunate thing with these spiking models and integrating this somewhat noisy velocity signal, is that, as you can see from the graph there, you have the ground truth value, the known head direction value in grey, and overlaid is the estimated value using the activity in the ring attractor. And as you can see, after a little while, just through random fluctuations, that will start to diverge and eventually become useless as a representation. So in order to fix that, we went back to the multi-prednet and we thought, right, well, we can get these multimodal visual tactile representations using multi-prednet. So of the two, vision we thought is more relevant to deciding which direction you're looking in. You know, your visual field changes quite substantially when you rotate. So we took the tactile part out, or rather there's nothing special that makes it a tactile part. It just depends on the input you feed it. So we fed this what was then the tactile stack head direction data, and trained it on a data set gathered from the robot rotating on the spot, in a circle, random walk, various data sets we used. And by presenting pairs of visual scenes and head direction values, once we then obscure head direction, this reconstructive process can take over, and it can reconstruct an estimate for us of where the robot should be facing, based on whatever its visual input is at the time. And so from that, because now we have a model that can give us a head direction estimate, we can then turn that into a correction for our nest model. So we would take the outputs of the multi-prednet, we'd convert that into current, and then inject it into the nest model. And we tried several iterations of this, and eventually we got to the point where not only can we use the odometry from the robot as our, the odometry of the robot as a corrective influence, we can also use, as a training set, the activity of the ring itself. So we can let the ring attractor run for a little while before it gets drifty, use that small data set as a training set for the multi-prednet, and then from that, from then on, once the network starts to drift, the multi-prednet can take over and apply those corrections. So then, of course, now that we come to all this, we've done all the components, we then were able to put all this together as a unified system within the NRP. So here on the left, bottom left, we have our nest model of the ring attractor. Over on the top right, you've got the whisk guy there moving around in a virtual environment, rich visual scenes that it can use to map to particular head directions. And then in the middle there as an intermediary, with a bit of fettling, we've got the TensorFlow model to work alongside the NRP, and the TensorFlow model can take whatever the robot is seeing as those images become available. When images aren't available, the ring attractor does its own thing and gives you an internal, ever-present estimate of head direction. And because we know that's drifty, when you get a visual input, the TensorFlow model can then apply corrections to that model. So it's sort of a fully integrated system for maintaining your head direction working within the NRP. And then just as a sort of the final point, so we've got this system working in a live setting where you've got this live bidirectional interaction between machine learning models, spiking neural networks, and simulated robotics. And because you're able to track for example, the prediction error from the predictive coding network, if I can just direct your attention to the what's labeled figure, the bottom figure that's labeled figure B, we took it through various tasks like, for example, occlusion, where you would regularly interrupt the visual field or have big obstacles that weren't in its training set. And as you can see, the line in green, you get this regular error spikes you can see from the predictive coding network as it moves outside of what its training set is. And that signal could be used for many different things. You know, if you've got that error signal, that uncertainty rising, that could be a trigger for learning or a trigger for taking action to get around your occlusion. Lovely. So that's everything. Just left to thank many different colleagues, past and present, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tom. May I ask Julian and Jens to the stage again, because we have time for the questions for the first session. Yeah, Thomas, I tried to stop you.
Sorry.
So please come to the microphones if you have a question for the speakers of the first round. First part of the session, no questions. So then let's thank them again. I think it was a great demonstration. Was this possible by using the eBrains tools in collaboration in the Human Brain Project? And now I have to announce the second half of the session. It's about brain-inspired robotics and computing, future directions, and now it's not the young researchers anymore, but the not-so-young researchers. And it's a little bit unlucky that I now have to announce myself, because I have the first talk in this session. My name is Johannes SCHEMMEL. I'm from the Electronic Visions Group from the Kirchhoff Institute for Physics in Heidelberg University. And I will talk about spike-based analog computing with brain scales towards physical models of the brain. And first I want to repeat what Julian already explained. What are physical models? Not everybody is aware that there is a different kind of possibility to model the brain than numeric simulations, you all know, like NEST. But you can also think about the equations that govern the physics in a simple description, for example, of the cell membranes, the membrane voltage of a neurons, you can see it here. And then you translate the different components, for example, to an electrical circuit that behaves similar to the equation. So this, if you then measure the voltages across the capacitor here in this circuit, you get a solution for this differential equation. And by this, you can model the behavior of a neuron while you represent all the parameters as physical quantities, like a voltage, current, or charge. You do not move to numbers or numeric representations. And one byproduct of this is, if you use modern microelectronics, is that the rate of change of the voltage is much higher than in biology, because the capacitances are smaller and the currents are higher, and that leads you to an accelerated neuron model. It is still a continuous time model, but you have a fixed acceleration factor. In our case, it's between 1,000 and 100,000, and all core constituents, so all synapses and neurons, they have physical instances in these systems. But they are not made from molecules, from biochemical molecules, but they are made from microelectronic constituents, like field effect transistors on a silicon chip. And this is then what we came up with in our lab. Brain scales chips, or ASICs, they are a physical model of spiking neural networks, and it's not the single cell model, but it's structured neurons where we have a physical model for each individual compartment, and this model is a little bit more complicated than just the Leak equation you have seen so far. It adds the terms of the full ADX model, and then you can connect these compartmental neuron models to any kind of neuron you want to investigate. In this example here, for example, we set up a coincidence detection paradigm for Matthew Larkham and showed that this kind of physical model can replicate the measured behavior of a cell in the Petri dish. So this is the basic principle behind our physical models. And one thing in addition we need, because all the parameters you have in these physical models, they need to come from someplace. They have to be set. And one interesting mechanism to set these parameters is try to adjust them during operation of the system by some kind of plasticity mechanisms. And therefore, we created a scheme we call hybrid plasticity, where we have analog measurements done in the synapses and the neurons, and a digital processor to perform the calculations of the weight and topology updates. And by this, you can more or less implement a vast variety of different algorithms. You are not limited to a predefined set of algorithms. And this algorithm calculation can include synaptic weights, obviously, but also pre-post correlation values like STDP. This is shown at the bottom, but also you can change the topology and implement structural plasticity, or you can read out neuron voltages and firing rates to generate, for example, third factor rules or so. And you can also change the neuron parameters by this plasticity rule, so not only the synaptic parameters. This kind of combination of digital processor and analog core then is what we want to replicate in larger tile-based systems to really be able to create physical models of parts of a brain or small animal brains, and later maybe even bigger animal brains. Currently, we only, since in HBP, we only managed to build a 2-tile ASIC that has 2 processors and 2 neuron blocks and 10,000 synapses and 500 neurons, or compartments would be the better term for this. But it allows on-chip training with complex learning rules, and the learning capabilities, they scale with the system size, since all the calculations are done locally in these processors close to the analog cores where the physical model of the neurons is located. And by this, it can cope up with also with the scaled-up speed of the accelerated physical model, because you do not have a bottleneck in communicating to some kind of host computer systems. And now to the important part. Obviously, BrainScales is part of eBrains. It is part of the brain-inspired technologies. And all this complicated stuff I have shown you, so that you have a processor, you have parameters, and so this all needs some user interface. And that was an important part of the work in BrainScales to, I think for the first time ever, create a user interface for an analog physical model system for neuroscience that allows you to use the same simple access to the internal parameters like you have with a numerical simulator. So you, in a very similar way, like using Nest, you can also use the BrainScales system. You have these Jupyter notebooks in the eBrain Collab, where you then can write some. Can you switch this off, please? Okay, thank you. No? Okay. Yeah, you can, in a similar way, then you would do this with Nest. Here on this screen, you see an example of the tutorials we have, and also the link if you want to use it. And here are some examples from collaborations we already had during HBP, where external users, also external to the, our Heidelberg group, together with people from Heidelberg, implemented interesting examples like structural plasticity, spike-based inference, or the research about criticality in recursive networks, all things which are very well suited to the acceleration of this physical model. And here also the concept of the high-level support team played an important role, because since this technology is different from what you are used, even with the easy access Python-based interface, you still need people in Heidelberg to collaborate with the researchers that want to use the systems to solve problems and get these things done. And we have a lot of successful examples collected during HBP. I won't go through the list, don't worry. The 3 red emphasized by the red rectangles, these are the ones I have just shown, but as you can see, there are a lot of others. And you can also see from that BrainScales is not a one-trick pony. It's built for a lot of different kind of problems. It's like a general-purpose analog emulator of artificial neural networks. So if you have some idea you want to try in a physical model instead of a numerical model, you just contact us, or you just try it out by yourself. If you have an eBrains account, that's all you need. So to summarize, BrainScales 2 is a physical substrate with continuous time neuron dynamics. That's the most important difference to a numerical simulator. You have a continuous operation as long as you wish. Like a living being, it just it sits there and operates, and you can modify it and poke it from the outside, give it information, and see what happens. It supports a lot of different neuromorphic algorithms. You can implement deep networks. That's what Julian showed you. You can even implement non-spiking stuff if you're interested in machine learning. You can use it for brain emulation with complex neuron models to fit experimental data, for example, like large pyramidal neurons, where it's difficult to fit the parameters from experiments even with a numerical model. You can use it for local learning with hardware support to test your ideas of a plasticity rule. Thanks to the acceleration factor, you can do meta-learning, like learning to learn loops, and test a lot of different parameters for your plasticity rules. Thanks to the acceleration factor, you can still do this in a short time frame. And also, it supports not only STDP, but also structural plasticity and more complex learning rules based on voltages, even in multi-compartment setups. And it's publicly available via the European eBrain service. And as you all know, it's not yet funded after the end of the Human Brain Project, like maybe other parts of HBP, but we all hope that this will be solved. And it uses an easy PyNN-based API. PyNN is a language also developed in the Human Brain Project. It's also available in Nest for numerical simulations. It allows you to easily describe an artificial neuron model you want to evaluate. And we have high-level support available, and that, I think, is very important. Thomas Lippert pointed this out already yesterday. The high-level support is essential in this kind of endeavor. Brainscale's architecture can also be scaled to larger size multi-chip networks. Unfortunately, we have not been able to demonstrate this in the HBP, but we hope that this will be part of the next major version of the Brainscale's ASIC. And so I thank you, and I want to emphasize again here that this would not have been possible without Karl-Heinz MAYR. That's the reason why I show this old group photo. Thank you. So now I switch back to my role as the session chair, and we will have the questions later. And I think the next one is, it's Silvia. Silvia TOLU, please come up. Silvia works at the Technische University of Denmark, and we will see what she will present us.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the invitation, introduction, Johannes. I come, from the Technische University of Denmark in Copenhagen, and there I'm leading the Neurorobotics Technology Lab. So my field is neurorobotics, and today I'm presenting you some of the main works that we have done in this field. But the main purpose of my talk is also to convince you about the potential of neurorobotics to investigate brain diseases. So, first of all, in neurorobotics, we have two aims, and the first is to create autonomous systems, which means machines that have the neural controllers in order to make them intelligent and able to perform like biological systems, also humans. And by doing in my lab, in order to pursue this goal, so we are adopting actually neuromorphic computing and control approaches, for example, for manipulation and grasping, and for achieving compliant human-robot interactions. And also, we use neuromorphic software and hardware for anomaly damage detection and classification. The other aim of neurorobotics is understanding the brain, right? So if we are able to have a biological, realistic neural controllers, we can actually get insights about how the brain works, but also when the brain doesn't work. So this is another topic in my lab, so to investigate brain diseases such as Parkinson's disease. So we are modeling Parkinson's disease and creating machine learning tools for symptom detection and classification, among other activities. Okay, so how do we do this? There are two main approaches. One is called exploration and one is called exploitation. These two approaches are actually, it's a trade-off occurring in the brain, and it naturally translates into the neurorobotics field. With the first one, exploration, so the goal is to verify neurological models and in order to reproduce behaviors in machines, while the second one seeks to reproduce cellular level models. and of course, also with the aim of reproducing behaviors of living systems. But there is a challenge. Of course, when we want to investigate these brain diseases, we are aiming to the exploitation type. And the challenge is that we have limited computational powers necessary for real-time operation, and also these models are effectively lacking biological realistic neural models. So we have to deal with this challenge, but we need to overcome this somehow. Today, I'm presenting you some of the works that we have done by exploiting the two approaches. The first one, type 1 exploration, is what you see in this video. So you see the ICAB robot and Neurorobotics that was developed in Neurorobotics platforms already some years ago. The purpose of this was to replicate the underlying mechanisms of the cerebellum for motor control and learning. And what we found out was that actually the interplay between two different kinds of internal models allowed the robot to accurate and smoothly act in that environment. So, for example, the forward model was able to achieve fast prediction of the movement besides the noise and disturbances acting on the table, being manipulated by the robot. And the inverse model was the one responsible for the long-term accuracy tracking. Another principle that we follow in neurorobotics is embodying intelligence. So here, in the previous example, there was a functional model of the cerebellum, and the performance was very far from demonstrating real-time computing. So in this other example, we decided to exploit neuromorphic hardware, such as SpiNNaker, in order to speed up the data processing. But what I would like you to focus your attention on is about the embodiment. So here we have a brain model embodied into the robot, which allows us to investigate brain-body interactions. And by doing so, we can actually study and analyze more realistic firing patterns, and it allows also running of larger scale networks in real time. Also, by having embodiment, we can really advance robots in performing different tasks, such as navigation and manipulation, as you see in these videos. And in particular, we can use real robots in real tasks and scenarios. And of course, as soon as the complexity increases, then we need brain capabilities, also because this allows us to go beyond the performance of traditional methods. Actually, in these works, we have been able to demonstrate that brain capabilities allows us to obtain autonomy against complex situations in which disturbances and noise are present, compared to other traditional control systems. So, online learning of a noun dynamics, for example, in the presence of coupling terms, allows us to learn with few data and few iterations and achieve smooth, fast tracking and disturbance rejections. Here, another example, we wanted to seek to understand how sensory motor coordination works. Actually, since we are born, we use something called the motor bubbling, which is a random generation of movements to create sensory motor maps. And by using this motor bubbling process, we implementing a spiking neural networks of the cerebellum, actually a fully spiking neural control, based also on the principle of the cerebellum, that was using this motor bubbling. And by having this system implemented, then we wanted to reproduce a test that is usually done by patients which is called the radial-reaching patients with the cerebellar diseases. And we were able to demonstrate that the robot was actually performing like real patients, so where the cerebellum was the one leading the time of the tracking, accuracy, and avoiding divergence from the initial point to the target point. Okay, so now, where is the brain disease investigation? Here, I'm proposing you an envisioned use case scenario for investigation of Parkinson's disease that consists in three phases. The first one is the model creation on the top in green, and it's basically it consists of creating a model of, for example, the basal ganglia, which is, as we know, one of the main parts affected by the Parkinson's disease. And the creation of this model starts from the data recorded from literature. And then by using machine learning tools, we can classify, analyze the data from Parkinson's disease subjects, and extrapolating digital biomarkers, we can optimize this model. And the second part, it consists in the testing. So when we have this computational model, we can nest it into a control system, to a closed control system that is based on a neuromusculoskeletal system of the PD subject. And then we can validate this model against the data recorded previously. But what is required to do this? So first of all, identification of key clinical features, which are needed in order to reduce the progress of the disease. Digital biomarkers, because the existing ones are too expensive and rely on invasive methods. Advanced simulation tools. Fortunately, we have the virtual brain on the eBrains that allows us to run large-scale simulations and collect a large amount of data. So these enable the personalized models to be created toward personalized medicine. Then we need high-fidelity brain models, so that leads to more realistic embodiment, and then a standardized methodology to use these machine learning tools always in the proper way. In my lab, we are now facing two of these main gaps, in particular regarding biological plausibility. So there is lack of study on brain disease using spiky neural networks. And the therapy for these neurodegenerative diseases still relies on these incomplete models. And then the musculoskeletal embodiment. So we need more control of passive joints, such as excitation of muscle pair, and realistic sensory feedback. So at the end of last year was published this work in Nature, which relates the existence of rotational dynamics in the population of lumbar spinal cord. So by getting inspiration of this work, we decided to build a central pattern generator that includes these rotational dynamics. And we have been integrating this into a musculoskeletal model of the rat for underlying the main root causes of Parkinson's disease in locomotion tasks. And here we have, I'm showing you some of the results which are under publication. Unfortunately, I cannot give much more details about this. And what we want to show is how we can get these locomotion symptoms in Parkinson's disease by producing a breakdown in the dopamine in the basal ganglia connected to the spinal cord. If we get these locomotion symptoms, then we can finally close the loop and go back and validate with the real data. So finally, this is what I envisage myself, the future of neurorobotics in neurodegenerative disease research. So starting from biological data collection, we can use the machine learning tools and visualization tools to compare and analyze the data coming from the neurorobotics experiments. And by doing this benchmark analysis, we can increase fidelity of our models and the results of all of this is creating synthetic testbeds for neurodegenerative diseases, achieving early diagnostic algorithms, and personalized patient care. Lastly, but not least, neurorobotics embodiment will allow neuroscientists to create new theories and, of course, reduce invasive experiments in animals and avoid humans to make repetitive and routinary experiments. I would like to conclude thanking my team and all the collaborators and you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk, Silvia. And the next speaker is Christian MAYR from the TU Dresden. Welcome, Christian.
Okay, so thanks for the intro, Johannes. And yes, I'm going to talk a bit about SpiNNaker 2 and my take on the future of neuromorphic compute. So SpiNNaker 2, you heard about SpiNNaker 1, quite a number of talks this morning. So it's basically a processor-based simulation, emulation platform for spiking neural networks, biologically inspired neural networks, and other stuff. Come on. Oop. No. Jetzt. Okay, so SpiNNaker 2, what's new about it? So of course we moved to a new semiconductor technology. We increased capacity by about a factor 40 to 50. So one of the old compute boards is now essentially one of those chips down there. And basically we added additional numerical accelerators. We redone the communication architecture. So all different kinds of things. What have we come up with? So it's basically a machine that can support artificial neural networks like deep neural networks, spike neural networks, etc., with its numerical accelerators up to 10 to the 14 parameters in real time. So the millisecond is built in there. You basically plug in cameras, whatnot, at one end of the machine. You get actuators on the other end of the machine. You get a response inside a millisecond. And of course, you know, GPT-4, it's around 10 to the 12 parameters. So that's about 10 to the 14, so we still have a factor 100. So we can't go to really, basically, very large models. And yes, that's, of course, teamed up with Manchester, but a lot of that was also done locally in Dresden. So that's my group at TU Dresden. Then, of course, Global Foundries in Dresden provided the technology, and we've got a spin-off, SpinCloud Systems. So yes, I'm wearing the hoodie the guys gave me to exploit the machine. So what's the current state? We will have the machine deployed in autumn this year. That's 10 million processors, 70,000 chips, and it's petaflops or exaflops, depending on how you see it. So it's basically, the world's largest platform for real-time AI, essentially. And in terms of what concerns us here, it will be capable of simulating about 50 billion spiking neurons. So simple leaking integrating fire, of course. If you go to more complex neurons, number goes down. And of course, I would ideally get neuroscientists interested in this machine. Uptake has been kind of slow so far, but guys, this machine exists. Take advantage of it. And of course, we are doing with various industries. I'm going to show you a couple of use cases on the next slides. Totally different stuff on the machine. So of course, lots of robotic stuff, but even as far out as drug discovery. Okay, so one of the things on the AI side that we're doing is basically merging different streams of AI. So SNNs, DNNs, and symbolic AI, for example, for autonomous robots. So we've got also in the company basically things like Amica from the engineered arts people in the UK. We're actually running their routines on SpiNNaker on the first boards. And this is really about using DNNs because they can handle real-world data, using efficiency features, this whole event coding that you get from SNNs, and using various things like prediction, distributed decision-making to get the latency down, to get the energy efficiency up. And basically, once we have the sparse event-based representation of information that the robot interacts with, you have a natural kind of connection to a symbolic layer because abstract representation means high-level symbolic representation. So this is one project we're going to start actually mid of this year, and really working on getting a symbolic AI layer on top of what we do. And actually, by the way, this is what DARPA calls the third wave of AI, if you connect essentially those three domains. Okay, let's talk about something completely different. Non-AI, non-neuroscience. What can I use the machine for else? Now, the thing is, you have a huge number, it's called ridiculously parallel, number of compute units there for very simple operations. It could be neurons, it could be something totally different. The machine is also very good at representing high-dimensional numerical rooms and especially looking for sparse solutions to some numeric problem there. It's very good at stochastic commutation because, we basically built it for also stochastic synapses. You get lots of stochastic models in neuroscience, so that's what you also built in there. And of course, it's built for solving systems of locally coupled differential equations. So I did this table. I'm not going to go into details, just to contrast it against high-performance computing and quantum computing. I'm actually somewhere in the middle between the two. So it's quite interesting. So you can do basically highly parallel, asynchronous, sparse stuff on the machine in terms of general numerical compute. So one of the things we're doing is drug discovery. That's actually teamed up with Merck and Bayer and the MAYR lab in Vanderbilt, which basically means you've got these big databases where you get 100 billion designer molecules. And you essentially want personalized medicine. So you want this matched up to markers you have identified from a particular human. And you just cannot do that in a Petri dish for 100 billion molecules. It's totally prohibitive. So what you need to do is scan it. And when you scan that on your large GPU cluster, it still takes weeks. So it's no way for personalized medicine. You need an answer inside hours. So we have mapped this to individual chips now, and we're very confident that we can actually get this scanning time down to hours, basically. And that really enables personalized medicine. So we extract sparse markers from these virtual molecules. We match them up against individual receptors. It's a mixture, basically, again, of event-based stuff, of DNN stuff, and of regular C code just running on the process of SpiNNaker 2. And in the end, we come up with basically just 100 matches, and those we can then really, in a Petri dish, test against cultured human cells, how they work with. So that's one of the things. Other direction. The other one, I said, stochastic computing. So the machine has a large number of basically random generators, true and pseudo-random number generators. It can actually integrate that into the decision-making on the processors. So this caught the eye of IQM. IQM is this big Finnish startup that does quantum computing, largest European quantum computing business, actually. And we're exploring various categories with them, how a quantum computer and SpiNNaker 2 could interact. And one of those could be the one depicted here. So that's a Monte Carlo problem, like you find in physics or in finance. You want to get at the underlying distribution of a certain process. And this hybrid model here is actually running the quantum computer and SpiNNaker 2 in a loop, where you have an implicit type of model implemented on the quantum computer, but you do the explicit Monte Carlo sampling on SpiNNaker or on a classical computer. And in the loop, basically, you can actually have synergies. So that system can do very fast Monte Carlo sampling, get very fast at the underlying distribution, faster than either of those two systems could do on its own. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is actually where do we go from here. So as I told you, for SpiNNaker 2, we're just starting to explore the machine, of course. So yeah, so it's going to be 6-7 years at least we can make productive use of SpiNNaker 2. But of course we have to think of the future again, because in 6 years we need a replacement for SpiNNaker 2, and not surprisingly, of course, we call it SpiNNaker 3. We actually had a large discussion about this. Do we call it SpiNNaker 3? Machine beyond that, we won't call SpiNNaker 4. Then the numbering kind of game gets old, but we decided on SpiNNaker 3. So what's new about SpiNNaker 3 then? Why do we already think about it? SpiNNaker 1 was this standard ARM AP-based system in 130 nanometer, which was a current technology at that time. It's very much focused on this whole machine level, on the interconnects. And it's, of course, focused on brain simulation and neuromorphic compute, like we've seen. Then SpiNNaker 2, I've given you a couple of examples. It's already way more general, so you can do lots more different stuff with it. In SpiNNaker 2, we actually focused a lot on the individual processors, the numerical units. So that's, of course, where my group comes from in Dresden. We did a lot of kind of processor design work in the past. So yes, as I said, newer technology, 50x scaling, etc., etc. So where do we go with SpiNNaker 3? We actually bring, from an architecture perspective, the two together. So we think a lot about the architecture again, and about the chip, and really the machine as a whole. So we didn't really connect those two. In SpiNNaker 2 and SpiNNaker 3 we will of course go to ideally 3 nanometer TSMC, 100x scaling capacity again, because that's where we see the field evolve. Models just get bigger. It also helps you, of course, with mobile robotics. You can cram more and more inside a mobile robot, essentially. And the target is to go even more general. So it will be an event-based general purpose compute platform. So our vision is also to have it as a platform for artificial general intelligence, because no one yet knows where those algorithms actually will go towards. So SpiNNaker 3 basically starts this summer. We're actually in deep discussions already about the architecture, and we've secured local funding from our science ministry. So we'll get going with an initial 10-person team on the design work this summer on the new machine, so that we really, in 29, have a replacement system ready, basically. And yes, so that's the end of my talk. So that's my group in Dresden, 40 people about-ish. Of course, we teamed up with the Manchester guys for this. And actually, a lot of our startups from my chair here have also chimed in. So RACIX helped with the implementation 22 nanometers. Silicon Alley helped out with the link structure. Coinbau, we learned how to integrate stuff at rack level. And Spin Cloud Systems is, of course, commercializing the machine. And yes, if you want to connect with the machine, of course, there's remote access possible in Dresden. We don't yet have eBrains integration. That will be for the future. But definitely just connect with us. We can give you remote access. At the moment, individual boards, so they are available. And of course, later this year, basically the big machine. And yeah, SpiNNaker 1 won't be a single site installation. So we're in deep talks with Sandia, Oak Ridge, Johns Hopkins, et cetera, various German AI centers. So they all want a piece of it. So SpiNNaker 2 will be not just at the single board level like SpiNNaker 1, SpiNNaker 2 at rack level will seriously be distributed over this planet. That's already emerging right now. And as I told you, then the next thing for us is exploiting SpiNNaker 2 like crazy, and of course, starting design work on SpiNNaker 3.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating outlook you presented, Christian. Now we come to the last talk of the session. And after that, you will have a chance for questions. I will introduce now Fabrice MORIN from the Technische Universität Munich. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Johannes. Good morning, everybody. I'm perfectly aware that I'm the last obstacle between you and your meal, so I'll try to be quick. I will talk about the future of neurorobotics. The neurorobotics platform that we have developed within the HBP will be in the background of everything I'm going to say, but I want to talk a little bit more about the field in general and what it needs really to take off. So, first of all, a reminder of what we call neurorobotics. Basically, it is the approach that we have taken to both create and understand functional systems that come from the neural system by embodiment and by connecting really neural models to bodies in order to implement closed-loop interactions with the environment that sustain a realistic or semi-naturalistic type of activity in the brain models that we can then observe and use. And really the key things in that approach is the creation aspect, making things out of the knowledge that we get from neuroscience, and really focusing on the function of those things. So in terms of what we have achieved in the HBP, I think we have had a few works that are noticeable and that really carry the seed of what neurorobotics as a field could evolve into. I won't have the time to go into any kind of details in those things, but I want still to focus on a few of them. Apologies to the people that I will not cite in the following, but I had to make choices due to time and reduction of my speaking time. So the first thing that I want to mention is the large-scale brain model integration with the Neurorobotics platform. I think it is a very interesting pathway to really contextualize the full brain activity of a model in the context of a task, and therefore to see how this activity emerges and complements the function that is being executed by the body. This is an ongoing work with Japanese colleagues of ours that will, I believe, survive the end of HBP and hopefully extend in the future. And I think there will be some future very interesting publications coming out of this approach. Another interesting piece of work is the one that has been carried out by Professor Michele Migliore and his student Simone Coppolino on the use of hippocampal models for learning sequences in navigation tasks. I think this is an extremely nice demonstration of iterative model refinement that has led to a series of publications, and where, very interestingly, the process that has been used brings explainability to the function that is being implemented. And this is an aspect that is extremely important. We'll get back to that later. Another piece of work that is ongoing is the prototyping of applications that are based on neuromorphic computing. So really the concrete use of neuromorphic computing for what we hope will be translated into real-world applications. And the interesting part of that work is that we are leveraging the framework that was developed within HBP at ULISH, the Learning to Learn framework, with NMC principles in mind. And this is, I believe, a work that is not based on gradient descent stuff, but that leverages evolutionary algorithms. And this, I think this is, for the future, something extremely promising. We have also been working with companies, and those companies have essentially been using our technology for the design of exoskeletons. We have been using, for example, with Alpine Intuition and Autonomio to develop personalized exoskeletons, and they have done most of the heavy lifting, but we have supported them with the simulation part through the NRP. And I hope you were able to discuss with our colleagues from BitBrain and the CEO, Javi Minguez, who were there at our booth in the past 2 days, and who I think proposed a very interesting and stimulating paradigm, which is the digital twin for the personalization of rehabilitation therapy. So these are the kind of works that I think we can be proud of and that we should absolutely build upon in the future, and that are coming from HBP. Now, I'm going to move a little bit away from HBP and talk about more generic challenges of neurorobotics as a field. And, well, I don't know where to start, except maybe from the fact that at the moment I am not really aware of any theoretical work that shows and demonstrates how neuromorphic computing can do things better than standard engineering approaches. I know there are considerations of energy and power consumptions, but in terms of function, I am not aware of any real advantage of using spikes over something much more standard like controllers and so on and so forth. I think there is a lot of theoretical work that is needed on that side. And then when this theoretical work is done, we need to make sure that we use it and leverage it to implement functions that are explainable. Otherwise, we will never make the connection to the real world and real applications. And if we want to make that connection, then in turn we need to have engineering tools and basically a tool chain in place to validate, test, and benchmark whatever neuromorphic application that we can imagine. Of course, there is the elephant in the room, which is backpropagation. Do we leverage it through new strategies? Do we do away completely with backpropagation? I would say that evolutionary strategies have a place in neuromorphic computing, and maybe they have been a little bit too ignored so far. Another big thing that I think we need is the development of spinal cord models. There will be a treasure trove of things to learn from the spinal cord for robotic motor control, but also in terms of applications with motor diseases and impairments. I think the talk by Andreas Rovald yesterday was remarkable in that aspect. And finally, there is the really, I would say, engineering part of the neurorobotics and neuromorphic computing, which is the connection and the embedding into real applications. So things like form factors and creation of interfaces is really something we're going to have to work on hard. Now, I want to mention what is being done in the context of AI-enabled robotics by a small company that you may have heard of, which is called NVIDIA. Because then you will see how this can be, let's say, expanded and how this can drive a little bit what we can do with neurorobotics. So NVIDIA has been becoming slowly an absolute reference in terms of the tools to create in simulation AI-enabled robotics. The first thing they did really is to create a system for gathering and creating assets that they call Omniverse. Omniverse is not only a library, it's also a set of tools that are interoperable in order to produce those assets. And they made it available to everybody. Then they leveraged a lot of things coming from the video game industry and especially game engines. And it so happens that, for example, the Unreal has demonstrated a game engine just a few days ago, which is capable of procedurally generating photorealistic, large-scale scenes that are absolutely ideal for the type of simulations that the platform Isaac Sim is implementing. And then they added a software layer on top of that to actually have either model training or things like synthetic data generation. And then, of course, because they are a hardware provider, they made sure that they had correct form factors with their Jetson systems, for example, for actually embedding applications into real applications. So, is there something equivalent for neurorobotics? Well, I would argue that HBP has started to lay some foundations. First of all, we have neural assets. Obviously, we have models, we have data. And what we do have are some tools that are capable of procedurally generating for example, neural circuits and more. We, of course, leverage in the Neurorobotics platform all those gaming engine technologies, simulation technologies, etc. And I think what we have just heard about SpiNNaker 2 would be, for example, extremely interesting, mixing FEM simulations together with simulation of neural circuitry in the spinal cord, for example, would probably be fantastically interesting to somebody like Andreas Rovald. We have also developed a series of methodologies for training our models, and of frameworks like L2L that we're currently using. And of course, well, we have some actual hardware, for example, SpiNNaker 2, but also the AE Stream library that we have just heard from Jens. And I think this is, what an equivalent tool chain could look like within HBP. So conclusion, because I'm already late, we are far from having, let's say, the ecosystem and the tool chain that we need, but we're getting there. HBP has laid some foundations, but this need to be preserved and considerably extended. And obviously, well, we have a little problem of funding here now. eBrains has remained, let's say, very cold on neurorobotics as a field until now. I can only hope that this will change. I'm not sure there is time enough for that, but this is what it is. This is the last time I address you, so I want to thank all the people who fought tooth and nail for the Neurorobotics platform. During SGA3, I really want to thank the NRP core team, Eloy Retamino, Ugo Albanese, Christophe Lebioda, Victor Vorobiev, and Sandro Weber. And I want to leave you with some food for thought. I will be delighted to discuss those quotes. Thank you very much.